Welcome back, everyone. We are going to go to the next and final presentation of the day, and that is a presentation done by Alain Schatt. And Alain Schatt is a full professor of financial accounting at HEC Lausanne, University of Lausanne. His field of research is in auditing. His research focuses on the audit market, and in particular he is interested in the consequences of specific regulation on audit quality and on the value of public firms. He has looked on how small errors can lead to big mistakes, an important issue. Well, and today he's going to talk about how joint audits may affect the audit function. The title of his presentation is The Economic Consequences of Joint Audits, and I would like to invite Alain to give his presentation. I'm looking forward to that a lot. Thank you.
Right, okay. So before starting my presentation, I would like to thank the organizer of the conference for having included our project in the program, but I would like to thank FAR for the financial support for this project. Okay, so let me introduce the topic and the key questions. So what is joint audit? Joint audit means that companies must appoint two different audit firms who share the work and sign the audit report. Joint audit exists in France since 1966, but you have to know that it was also mandatory in Denmark until 2005 and in Canada until 1991, but just for banks. What is interesting here is that some regulators and authorities suggested the introduction of joint audit in Europe, and you can find some info about that in the green paper entitled Audit Policy Lessons from the Crisis, disclosed by the European Parliament or by the European Commission. But in the Netherlands, a report published in 2018 by the Dutch Authority for the Financial Markets also suggests the introduction of joint audit. So these initiatives lead us to ask two key questions. The first one is, should other countries, such as the Netherlands, for example, introduce mandatory joint audits, or should France abandon joint audits, which is exactly the opposite in some sense. Our paper or our project tries to provide some answers to these questions by analyzing the economic consequences of mandatory joint audit. More precisely, we have in mind three main economic consequences of joint audits. The first one is audit market concentration. And the question here is, does joint audit lead to lower market concentration? The second dimension or economic consequences is about audit quality, and the question is, does joint audit lead to higher audit quality? And the last consequence is audit fees, the cost of providing audit services. And the question here is, does joint audit lead to lower audit fees? So in other words, we try to understand if joint audits really break the oligopolistic market and therefore lead to a better quality price ratio of audit services for clients. Okay, so let's start with the first economic consequence of joint audit, which is audit concentration. So the question is, do joint audits really lower the market shares of Big Four firms? I have to remember that this is a key objective for several regulators because the Big Four capture about 90% of the fees paid by listed firms in Europe. If you're interested by this topic, I suggest to read a recent analysis by Marlene Willekens published in 2019, which provides a lot of numbers about that. It also means that, of course, if the market share of Big Four firms decreases, then the market share of local firms would increase, which would suggest that clients prefer more audit services from non-Big Four firms, which is, to be honest, a strong hypothesis given the production constraints of small auditors. In other words, small auditors are not able to follow large firms. Okay, from a theoretical point of view, the objective of the regulator to limit the market share of Big Four firms is based on the key idea that an oligopolistic market is associated with lower competition. However, we know that it's not true. It's not necessarily the case. The fact that many companies change their auditor every year suggests clearly a real competition between auditors, especially between Big Four firms. So even if there's no joint audit, there is, or without joint audit, there is a lot of competition on this market. So concentration should not be a real issue. Another argument of regulator is that the huge market share of Big Four firms leads to a greater systemic risk, meaning that there is a greater risk of disruption in the audit market if one of the Big Four firms fails. However, the fact that we reduce the concentration of this market does not mean that this risk disappears totally, because the reduction of the systemic risk largely depends on the existence of large non-Big Four firms. And this is something that is not true in practice. We don't have a lot of large non-Big Four firms. From a more practical point of view, joint audits may have a different impact on market concentration when concentration is measured with a number of clients or with the audit fees. In fact, in a mandatory joint audit context, we know that, as I will explain later, that Big Four firms usually audit the largest companies, which pay higher fees. Second, for a given client, the Big Four firm may appropriate a greater proportion of the fees when the second auditor is a non-Big Four firm, which reflects what we call joint audit imbalance. So what I'm just saying here is that measuring market shares with a number of clients or with audit fees leads to different results. Okay. So what have we learned? What does academic research suggest about audit concentration in France? First, when we use the number of clients as a measure of concentration, we show that the French audit market seems less concentrated than other European markets, which suggests that joint audit has positive consequences or good consequences in terms of audit market concentration. However, when we look at the audit fees paid to Big Four firms, we see no difference basically with other countries. Because as I said, the Big Four firms audit the largest client, and when they work with a smaller auditor, they capture a large part of the audit fees. So this is interesting because when you consider the audit fees paid to Big Four firms, so there's no difference in France and in the other countries. Thanks to FAR and the financial support of FAR, we were able to collect a lot of data on the French market, and we give you here some numbers. So for about 10,000 mandates, so number of audit of firms, we find the following results. First, the market share of the Big Four firm and the next two largest firms has increased over the years between 2002 and 2017. The Big Four firm, the market share was 46% in 2002 and it's 55% now, meaning that the market share of small firms declined significantly over the period. When you look at audit fees, you can see that in 2017, Big Four firms captured 82% of the fees, and the small firms capture only 3% of the audit fees. Okay, so even, as I said, in a context of mandatory joint audit, Big Four firms have huge market shares when you consider audit fees. Another result is that when you look at the pair of auditor, the pair of auditor means that Some companies can hire 2 Big Four, some companies can hire 1 Big Four and 1 non-Big Four, and some companies can hire 2 non-Big Four firms. What we see here is that about 60% of the companies are audited by a pair composed of a Big Four and a non-Big Four firm. Okay, and joint audit imbalance is greater in that case, meaning that Big Four capture a large part of the fees in that case. Besides, we see that the proportion of companies audited by 2 Big Four firms has increased. Okay, over the period, we started with 17% and now we have 26%. So these results suggest that the market is really concentrated, okay, and that the market share of Big Four firms increased over the period, even in a context of joint audit. So let's turn to the second economic consequence, audit quality. So the question here is, do joint audit really increase audit quality? The idea is that joint audits having 2 auditors may be associated with more knowledge or competencies, and therefore a higher probability of detection of a breach. But joint audit may also be associated with a greater independence of auditors and therefore a higher probability of reporting a breach because it is easier for 2 auditors to resist managerial pressure. One may ask, however, a few questions. The first one is, do firms really want better audit quality? And the answer depends on the price a firm has to pay for higher quality, and I will come back to that later, as well as on the cost of other mechanisms already in place that help curbing earnings management and that lead, therefore, to higher financial reporting quality. From a practical point of view, one must admit that all these studies have some weaknesses, in particular because the audit quality is difficult to measure. Academic researchers use several measures of audit quality, such as abnormal accruals or going concern opinions, but all these measures are far from perfect to capture audit quality. So what have we learned about audit quality in France? Several studies, in fact, have found that audit quality captured by earnings reliability metrics is not higher in France than in other countries. Therefore, the joint audit system seems not to lead to higher audit quality. So the idea that 4 eyes are better than 2 is just a fiction. It's not true in practice. Let's now discuss the last economic consequence of joint audits, audit fees paid to auditors by the clients. So the key question here is, do joint audits decrease audit fees? Which is expected if joint audits lead to lower market concentration and increased competition. That's what economy theory suggests. However, one may argue that joint audit is costly, especially because there are some coordination costs between the 2 auditors, which may lead auditors to charge higher fees to the clients. So it's not clear at the end whether the benefits associated with higher competition are higher than the additional cost associated with joint audit, with this coordination cost. In fact, if the coordination costs are really high, it is likely that shareholders do not agree to pay higher audit fees. And this is even the case if audit quality is higher, as explained, as discussed previously. So what have we learned about audit fees paid to auditors in France? To date, only a few studies have compared the fees paid in France and in other countries. One interesting paper suggests that French firms pay higher audit fees than Italian and British companies. This difference, the difference of fees is about 30%, which is statistically and economically very significant. And it's much higher than what Mazar said to the European Commission a few years ago, when the Commission launched this green paper about audit market in Europe. So An additional question we must ask is whether the previous results about audit quality and audit fees are sensitive to the pair of auditors. More precisely, having two Big Four firms or having two non-Big Four firms may change audit quality and audit fees. To answer this question, one must take care of what we call self-selection, which means that the choice of a given pair of auditors is not random. In other words, large firms select different pair of auditors than small firms. In fact, what we know and what empirical literature shows is that large firms with diffuse ownership tend to hire two Big Four firms, whereas small family firms with a very concentrated ownership do usually not hire two Big Four firms, but two local firms or one big firm and one local firm. So this suggests that the choice of a given pair of auditors is driven by agency costs. Regarding audit quality, empirical research does not support the idea that the pair of auditors influences audit quality overall, even if one study published in 2017 shows that goodwill impairment seems sensitive to the pair of auditors. Regarding audit fees, several studies confirm that the presence of at least one Big Four firm increases audit fees and that a more balanced work between the two auditors enhances the audit fees. Okay. So overall, what have we learned about the French market, where joint audit is mandatory? First of all, mandatory joint audit is associated with lower market concentration when one focuses on the number of clients, but not when one focuses on audit fees captured by Big Four firms. Second, mandatory joint audit is not associated with audit quality. When France is compared to other countries, and this result holds for the various pairs of auditors, which is probably due to the fact that different pairs of auditors are in charge of different clients, as explained previously. Third, mandatory joint audit is positively associated with audit fees. Thus, French firms pay more audit fees to the clients, probably because of the large coordination cost in the joint audit system. Okay, so our initial question was, should other countries adopt joint audits or should France abandon joint audits? That were our initial questions. Before providing a clear answer to these questions, we need to mention some additional studies in the UK and in Denmark. First, a simulation in the UK suggests that the introduction of joint audit in the UK would significantly increase audit fees, which is bad news. Second, when Denmark stopped mandatory joint audit in 2005, some studies found that the audit market concentration increased, which is not surprising, but audit fees decreased without any significant impact on audit quality, which means that this decision to stop mandatory joint audit was ultimately good news for investors. Thus, when considering our results for the French market and the additional result in the UK and Denmark, it seems clear that the introduction of mandatory joint audit would probably be not associated with large benefits, but with additional costs for companies. So we conclude that it would be better not to introduce joint audit in another country, and France should probably abandon the joint audit system. This conclusion is based on the idea that joint audit is costly without clear benefits for investors, which are the ultimate clients. For auditors, however, joint audit means more revenues because audit firms charge that coordination cost to the clients. So the mandatory joint audit is basically good news for the auditors, but not for investors. For regulators, however, we acknowledge that the choice is more complicated because joint audits interact with other rules, such as the 6-year contract in France, for example, which means that when an auditor signs a contract with a company, this contract is valid for 6 years. You cannot fire the auditor before 6 years. So an important stream of literature has shown that a given rule may have different economic consequences in other institutional contexts. That's why it's not clear that transposing the joint audit system in France to another country would produce the same results. For instance, we know...
Alain, you have 5 more minutes.
Yeah, it's in 2 minutes it's done. So for instance, we know that the cost and the benefits of the mandatory adoption of IFRS were different across the world, which confirms this idea that the same rule will produce different consequences in different contexts. So one may notably expect different economic consequences if the joint audit is designed differently by national regulators, regarding, for instance, the balanced work between the two auditors or the legal responsibilities of the auditors. So to finish this presentation, I would just like to say that the final version of our paper should be available soon, and to thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. There's many questions, and I guess that Lucas will have some questions, so I would like to give the floor to Lucas Konijn of EY. Of the young professionals of EY and to discuss your paper. The floor is yours, Lucas.
Yes, thank you very much. Mr. Schatt, thank you for a very interesting presentation. I hope everyone was able to keep their focus for this last presentation, as it offered some interesting insights. But it remains a complex matter, of course, as there are so many different ways to joint audit prevail. And there is such a specific set of complementing regulations, which altogether make it a complex research topic, I think. Now, judging by the number and the level of questions, I think the audience has been paying attention, actually. So let's dive straight into those. Fortunately, I have the privilege to ask the first question. So my question to you is, to what extent is the law, or better said, the spirit of the law, being circumvented already by unequal balance in the audit, and by not holding both auditors responsible, as you showed in the Marionette case?
Yeah. So normally, Jean Bédard, my co-author, should respond to your questions. I don't know if Jean Bédard is online. No. Okay, so I will respond. Yes, it's a very good question, of course. I mean, the only thing I can say is a few years ago, what we call the H3C, the Haut Commissariat aux Comptes, which is the equivalent of the PCAO in the US, okay, this oversight, in charge of the oversight of the profession, said that this imbalance issue is a real issue, it's a big issue, okay? So, and the auditors were forced to change things, and now you have the obligation to pay at least 30% to one auditor and 70% the max for the other auditor. Before that, you had 90%, 10% for the big four, 90, 10% for the small auditor. But I agree, this is a good question. It's difficult to answer, but this imbalance issue is a really big issue here.
All right. Now, one other thing that we can all imagine, I think, is a question. Do you see common dyads of auditors of different firms regularly acting together? So standard sets basically joining forces all the time.
Well, it's a good research question, to be honest. Thank you for the question. I have no answer, but it's a very good research question. Yeah, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know.
Credits are not for me, actually, but this one was from the audience. Now, one question that we have also is, what does the data tell us about the emancipation of non-Big Four audit firms? In other words, do joint audits enhance the market chances of non-Big Four firms?
Sorry, do what? I didn't understand it.
Do joint audits enhance the market chances of non-Big Four audit firms? So do you see that they are more present and strongly active on the market, or?
It's difficult. One thing is that France has one second tier firm, which is Mazars. You probably know Mazars, which is a big firm. The question is Mazars a major actor in France today because of the joint system or for other reasons? That's a good question. As I said at the end, I don't know what would happen in the Netherlands or in the UK or in other countries if you implement joint audit, because to date, when you except for Grant Thornton, BDO, some big firms, okay, we don't have a lot of big second tier auditors around the world. France has Mazar, which is a specific case, but I don't know if it's related to the joint audit or not. It could be other reasons that explain why we have Mazar in France and not in other countries, something similar.
All right. That's of course a very interesting notion indeed, especially also given your specific set of regulations, especially the 6-year contract forms. Yeah. I find very interesting. Now, one other question from the audience is, how should education of financial auditors be adjusted to working as joint auditor for public interest entities?
Yeah, it's in practice, what we know from practice is that usually auditors split the work. One auditor is in charge of this part of the balance sheet, the other one is in charge of this part of the income statement, etc. So they split the work. So in practice, there's no real joint audit. I mean, you don't duplicate everything. One is not controlling the other auditor, okay? One auditor is not in charge of checking what the other auditor did. So the question is, what does it really mean in practice, joint audit? If you don't have a real joint audit, there's no need for specific education, of course. If you want to implement real joint audit, the idea is to see what the other auditor is doing, is to learn how to control what the second auditor is doing in practice. But today, there's no, in France, for example, there's no specific education because you have joint audit for sure.
All right, yes, of course, that makes sense. Now, one question from a researcher that I already quoted when writing my master thesis. Fun to see here. How is the work in a joint audit shared? Who decides how it is shared? Are both firms hired simultaneously or at different times? So it's a bit of a cocktail question. Apologies for that. So it basically is the question is on how does this process look? So is there? I think the spirit of the question is more who decides this division.
Yeah. I would say normally it should be the audit committee. We had a discussion about the audit committee with Anna before. The audit committee is in charge of that. To be honest, research knows nothing about that. We never learned anything about who is doing who makes a decision about the shared work between auditors. And this is a key question, of course. What we know implicitly, okay, but we have no study for that, is when you have a non-Big Four and a Big Four firm, the Big Four firm decides who is doing what, for practical reasons, because when you audit large groups, the small companies cannot go abroad, they don't have enough human resources to do everything, especially complex tasks. So the Big Four are doing what is complex, difficult abroad, okay, it takes a lot of time, a lot of resources, and small firms have just to do the easy stuff, okay? You see the point, okay? So that's what we know a little bit about the practice when you discuss with auditor, but we need a lot of new studies about that because it's a real question. How audit committees face this issue is something we should learn in the future.
Yes, but I guess it's a difficult thing to gather information on, right?
Difficult. Very difficult.
Yes, a closed market for researching, unfortunately. Now we have one other question that I would like to ask you. So it is well known that researchers' initial expectations are more likely to be found than the opposite. Now this makes sense if the academic researcher is well informed and thoughtful about their expectations. So if you think about it well in advance, of course you get a good hypothesis. However, it can lead to the confirmation bias. What were your initial expectations going into the research and why?
No, it's a good question. I mean, seriously, when you discuss with other researchers, a lot of people say that joint audit is a good thing. Joint audit is a good thing because you have this 4 eyes principle. Okay, 4 eyes is better than 2 eyes, so it's really useful. With the only question is it really, what is the cost for having higher audit quality? In our case, with Jean, when we started this project a few years ago, studying joint audit, and we have some project about that, we didn't really care about the results. I mean, we didn't have a specific bias, and I think researchers don't really have a specific bias in general. I hope so. I hope so. It should not be too subjective research. It should be very objective. So you have results, you have data, you compute, you analyze your data, you have results. Okay. As I said, some results show that, for example, audit quality is a little bit higher when you have a joint audit, but a lot of results say it's not true. So on average, you have more results saying joint audit does not lead to higher quality, and just a few results says the opposite. So that's why we conclude, based on the number of studies published, that joint audit has no impact on audit quality. But I agree, this confirmation bias is a big issue, of course. Yeah. Good question.
All right. Well, we have a very large number of questions actually. So let's do some more if you're okay with that.
Yeah.
So I think I kind of missed that thing, but what do large and medium non-PI French corporations do here? Do they often have a joint audit voluntarily? Because I think yeah, well, I'll let you answer the question.
No, in France, joint audit is mandatory. You have no choice. When you publish, sorry, just a detail, when you publish consolidated financial statements, which is the case for 95% of the listed firms, okay, on the French stock market. But for 5% of the companies, you don't have consolidated financial accounts today, and you have just one auditor, meaning that when you have the choice between having one or two auditors, you always select one auditor, never two. And what you see in Denmark, the studies in Denmark, when Denmark stopped joint audit in 2005, a very large majority of companies now stopped with joint audit. It's voluntary. You can do it if you want, but a lot of companies don't do it. They just use the services of one auditor, which is really interesting. Gives a choice to the people that select one auditor, never two. So that's what we see.
Yes, so there's a very clear preference from the corporate world to select only one.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you've researched the topic quite extensively. And of course, you have France as a huge case study.
Mm-hmm.
What would you advise our Dutch Authority of Financial Markets? Adopt or not adopt?
Not adopt.
Not adopt. I think that's a very
because
clear
I mean, but sorry, just to be clear, I would say not adopt, because what I see from the studies in France, in Denmark, that the cost of joint audit is high, and we don't see clear benefits of the joint audit. But to be honest, we use very imperfect measures of audit quality today, as you know. Okay, it's very difficult to capture audit quality. So maybe because we don't capture audit quality in a good way, it's better to say don't do a joint audit. If one can prove that joint audit leads to higher quality, then it changes everything. So what I'm saying is, with different measures of audit quality, we could have different results and it would change my conclusions. But with our actual measures of audit quality, the conclusion is clear, don't do it. And as I said, when Denmark stopped, things are better in Denmark. You pay less fees with the same audit quality, with these imperfect measures of audit quality.
All right. Good answer, I think so. Very elaborate. And we have another question, because, as I said, we have a lot of different varieties in which these joint audits prevail, of course, in practice. This one is on that. So do you think joint audits should require each auditor to review the other's work in key areas of the audit?
So the subject, well, I agree. I mean, this is real joint audit. This suggestion is, should we do a real joint audit or not? In practice, we don't do real joint audit because everybody is doing his job, his tasks, specific tasks. You put everything together at the end. You start at the beginning, you have common meeting. At the end, you have common meeting. You sign the report. But in fact, you have no control of what the other is doing. Yeah, which is a limit, because it does mean you don't have real joint audit in practice. So yeah, it's good, great question, great comment. Yeah.
All right. Yeah, let's do some more if you're okay, because I see that it raises a lot of questions with the audience. So, to which extent is a small group of worldwide audit networks, like we know it today, of course, not just the most efficient economic solution given the current regulatory context?
I don't know. I think it's pretty efficient. I mean, when you have global firms like, I don't know, like the automobile car industry, I don't know, a lot of industry are very concentrated, okay, and have subsidiaries all over the world, okay. So you need big four firms. You need very large networks to audit these large companies. It would not make sense to have local auditors to audit very large companies. Okay, it would be totally inefficient. So maybe the actual situation is not perfect. Having 4, 5, 6, 7 big firms would be better. But at least we need some very big companies to follow very big companies. That's the idea.
Yeah,
and you have economies of scale, you have a lot of economies of scale, etc. when you have these big firms. So I think it makes sense. I'm not paid by big four firms, okay? So I'm not a lobbyist here, but I'm just saying from an economic point of view, it makes sense to have these large companies to follow large firms around the world.
Yes.
Well, and small firms and small auditors cannot do it. Of course. No. Even think, sorry, I just give you another example. Think about the banking industry. The banking industry is very complicated, okay? Very complicated. When you talk with auditor from small firms, something I do sometimes in Switzerland, they say we are not interested by auditing these big banks because we don't have the expertise. We are not able to do it, basically. So big four firms, they say we have the expertise, we have a lot of human resources, a lot of internal education to do it. So what I'm saying is you need, when you have big banks like UBS or Credit Suisse or other banks around the world, you need a lot of expertise, a lot of people to do the jobs. That's why you have big firms. So it's not a choice being big. You are big because you have big clients in front of you. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yes, I think that's a very clear answer. I would like to compliment you on your presentation and thank you very much also for giving us the opportunity to ask all our questions. I will now give the word again to Jan.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I really enjoyed this a lot. Alain, and as you could see, there were many questions. Actually, there are still questions out there, and we will make sure that these will be answered in the podcast that will be recorded before long. So I would like to thank Alain and also Lucas for facilitating the discussion, and thank you very much.